Imagine, just for a moment, the noise of the modern world slowly fading away, the electric glow dimming until it disappears entirely, leaving behind an America where mornings began not with screens or alerts but with the soft creak of wooden floors, the smell of coal smoke drifting through thin walls, and a quiet broken only by wagon wheels and distant factory whistles, because in 1888 daily life moved at a slower, heavier pace, one that was felt in the muscles, in the lungs, and deep in the bones. The year 1888 was not remembered by most people as a turning point or a historic milestone, but as a long sequence of ordinary days filled with labor, repetition, and endurance. Days lived by factory workers, farmers, shopkeepers, homemakers, and children who carried responsibilities far earlier than we would expect today. And it is within these ordinary moments that the true texture of American life can be found. This is not a story about presidents or industrial tycoons or grand inventions, but about waking up in a modest wooden house, about preparing a simple meal by firelight, about walking through muddy streets or dusty roads, about hands growing rough from constant work, and about evenings that arrived not with entertainment, but with exhaustion and quiet relief, because this was the America most people knew in 1888. Part 1 begins in the early morning, because for most Americans the day started well before sunrise, not because they wanted it to, but because survival demanded it. And in homes without electricity or central heating, the cold of the night still lingered in the air as people rose slowly from narrow beds, already aware of the long hours ahead. There were no digital clocks or alarm tones, only mechanical ticking, habitual waking, or the simple necessity of being on time for work, and the first movements of the day were careful and economical, as stoves were relit, water was fetched or heated by hand, and layers of clothing were pulled on to protect against the chill that seeped through poorly insulated walls. Breakfast was rarely a moment of pleasure or conversation, but a practical pause meant to provide enough strength to get through the morning, often consisting of bread, porridge, eggs or leftovers from the night before, eaten quietly and without ceremony, because everyone in the household already knew their role and the work waiting for them outside the door. For men, the day usually meant long hours of physical labor in factories, workshops, rail yards, docks, or construction sites, where machines roared, air was thick with dust or smoke, and the body itself was the primary tool, pushed day after day with little expectation of rest, safety, or long-term security. For women, labor was constant but rarely acknowledged, as running a household in 1888 required endless physical effort, washing clothes by hand, cooking over open fires, sewing and mending, cleaning soot and dirt that returned daily, caring for children, and often taking on additional paid work to supplement the family income, all without the conveniences that would later make such tasks easier. Children were not shielded from responsibility, because in many families they were expected to contribute as soon as they were able, whether by working in factories, helping in shops, delivering goods, or assisting at home, and while some attended school when circumstances allowed, education was often interrupted or abandoned entirely when money was tight. As the morning progressed and towns filled with smoke, noise, and movement, the rhythm of 1888 America fully emerged, a rhythm shaped by necessity rather than choice, steady and exhausting, accepted not because it was easy, but because there was little alternative, and most people did not ask whether life could be different, only whether they could make it through another day. As the day moved forward into late morning, the streets of America in 1888 revealed a world that felt dense and physical, where every sound carried weight and every surface showed signs of constant use, because roads were often unpaved and turned to mud after rain or dust under the sun. Horses and wagons dominated transportation, and the air itself seemed permanently mixed with smoke, sweat, and the sharp metallic scent of industry. In larger cities, factory districts pulsed with movement, as thousands of workers flowed in and out of brick buildings, whose windows rattled from the vibration of machines inside, and once within those walls time seemed to slow and stretch, measured not in minutes but in repetitive motions, as hands fed raw materials into machines, pulled levers, lifted heavy loads, and repeated the same task hundreds of times in a single day. Work hours were long and unforgiving, often stretching 10, 12, or even 14 hours, with only brief pauses that offered little rest. And while accidents were common and injuries frequent, there was no guarantee of compensation, no real safety regulations, and no assurance that a worker who was hurt would ever be able to return, making each day of labor both necessary and quietly dangerous. Outside the factories, small shops and family businesses opened early and stayed open late, their owners standing behind counters for most of the day, selling basic goods, repairing tools, or providing services that the neighborhood relied upon. And although the pace here was slower than in the factories, the pressure to earn enough to survive was constant and unrelenting. For women who remained at home, the late morning was often the most demanding part of the day, as washing, scrubbing, and food preparation required hours of standing, lifting, and bending, with water hauled by hand and meals prepared from scratch. And the heat of the fire, combined with the smell of soap, grease, and damp fabric, created an atmosphere that was both familiar and exhausting. Children who worked experienced a different kind of time, one that blurred play and labor into a single routine, as they ran errands, delivered goods, cleaned floors, or worked beside adults in conditions that were loud, dirty, and physically taxing, learning early that usefulness mattered more than comfort. As midday approached, meals were simple and functional, often eaten where one worked or stood, consisting of bread, stew, potatoes, or whatever, could be prepared cheaply and quickly, and for many people lunch was less a break and more a brief refueling before returning to hours of continued effort. Despite the hardship, there was a quiet order to daily life in 1888. America, a shared understanding of routine and expectation, and while moments of laughter or conversation did exist, they were brief and unplanned, small sparks of humanity within a structure built around endurance rather than enjoyment. As the sun climbed higher and shadows shortened, the weight of the afternoon began to settle in, bringing with it deeper fatigue, slower movements, and the unspoken knowledge that the most difficult part of the day was still ahead. As afternoon settled in, time in 1888, America began to feel heavier, as if each hour pressed down a little more than the one before, because bodies that had already worked since before sunrise now moved more slowly, muscles stiffened, hands ached, and the mind narrowed its focus to simple repetition, to finishing tasks rather than thinking beyond them. Inside factories, the air grew warmer and thicker, especially in summer, and the constant motion of belts, pistons, and spinning wheels created a background hum that never truly stopped, a sound that workers often carried with them even after leaving, hearing it faintly in their thoughts as they continued their day, while supervisors watched closely, measuring productivity not by well-being but by output. On farms and in rural areas, the afternoon was shaped by the land itself, as fields demanded steady attention, animals needed care, fences required repair, and weather dictated the pace of work more than any clock. And although the open air offered relief from enclosed spaces, the labor was no less demanding, with sun, wind, and exhaustion slowly wearing down even the strongest bodies. In towns and cities, delivery boys wove through crowded streets, shopkeepers leaned against counters during quiet moments, and homemakers paused briefly to wipe sweat from their faces before returning to stoves, tubs, and washboards, because stopping completely was rarely an option, and rest came only in fragments measured in seconds rather than minutes. Children who worked felt the afternoon stretch endlessly, especially those in factories or workshops, where standing for long hours strained small bodies, and where the promise of evening felt distant and uncertain. Yet many of them accepted this routine as normal, having known no other version of childhood. As daylight slowly began to soften, a subtle shift occurred across the country, not marked by bells or announcements, but felt internally, as people began to think less about starting tasks and more about finishing them, less about endurance and more about getting through the final hours until work could finally pause. For some, the end of the workday arrived with the sound of a factory whistle or the closing of a shop door, while for others, especially women managing households, the concept of finished was far less clear, as evening chores still waited, meals still needed preparation, and children still required attention. Supper was usually the largest meal of the day, not because it was elaborate, but because it was the one shared moment when families might sit together, even briefly, eating stews, bread, beans, or meat when it could be afforded, speaking quietly about practical matters, and conserving energy rather than spending it on long conversations. After the meal, light faded quickly, and without electric bulbs to extend the day, homes grew dim, lit by oil lamps or candles that cast soft, uneven shadows across walls stained by smoke and time, and in this low-light movement slowed naturally, encouraging a kind of enforced calm. Evenings were not filled with entertainment in the modern sense, but with simple routines, mending clothes, sharpening tools, reading a newspaper aloud when someone could read well enough, or sitting quietly as fatigue finally caught up with the body. And while life was hard, these moments carried a quiet intimacy born from shared effort and shared silence. As night deepened and lamps were extinguished to save oil, families retreated to narrow beds, often shared, wrapped in heavy blankets, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the distant noise of the street or the wind outside, and preparing, without much reflection, to repeat the same routine again the next day. As the long day slowly unfolded in 1888 America, there was a quiet moment in the early afternoon when the body realized how much time had already passed. When the initial energy of morning had faded, and the remaining hours stretched forward like a road without shade, because most people had been awake and working since before sunrise, and rest was still far away. In factories, the afternoon carried a different weight than the morning. As the air grew warmer, the machines louder, and the repetition more difficult to endure. With arms moving almost automatically, eyes fixed on familiar motions, and minds drifting inward simply to escape the relentless sameness of the work, while the ticking of time was measured not by clocks but by aching muscles and growing fatigue. Outside those brick walls, city streets remained crowded and restless, filled with wagons creaking under heavy loads, horses stamping impatiently, vendors calling out their goods, and pedestrians navigating muddy ruts or dusty ground, all of it forming a steady background rhythm that defined urban life in 1888, without ever truly pausing. In homes across the country, women continued working through the afternoon with little acknowledgement or rest, tending fires, preparing food, scrubbing floors, and managing countless small tasks that kept households functioning, often pausing only briefly to gather themselves before returning to work that never seemed fully complete. Children moved through these hours with a quiet seriousness, whether they were laboring beside adults, running errands through town, or helping at home, learning early that usefulness was expected, and that time belonged not to leisure but to responsibility. As the sun began its gradual descent, a subtle sense of anticipation spread through daily life. Not excitement, but the quiet awareness that the most demanding part of the day was nearing its end, even though obligations still remained and fatigue had fully settled into the body. Work slowed not because it became easier, but because there was less strength left to give, and movements grew more deliberate, more careful, as people focused on finishing what absolutely needed to be done before darkness arrived. Evening meals were prepared with efficiency rather than enthusiasm, using whatever ingredients were available, and when families gathered to eat, the atmosphere was calm and subdued, marked by practical conversation or comfortable silence, as everyone conserved energy in the low light of oil lamps and candles. After supper, the world contracted inward, streets emptied more quickly, shops closed their doors, and homes became quiet spaces of routine and recovery, where clothes were mended, tools set aside, and the day was slowly put away without reflection or ceremony. As lamps flickered and shadows stretched across familiar walls, fatigue softened thoughts and slowed speech, and bedtime arrived not as a choice, but as a necessity, as bodies surrendered to rest in preparation for another early morning that would arrive all too soon. Night came early in 1888, arriving not as a sudden curtain but as a slow dimming of the world. When the last rays of light slipped behind roofs and the streets grew soft and indistinct beneath the yellow glow of gas lamps, the city sounds changed as well. The clatter of wagons faded, the whistles of factories fell silent one by one, and what remained was the distant rhythm of footsteps, the quiet voices of neighbors speaking at doorways, and the faint hum of life retreating indoors. Inside homes, lamps were trimmed low to save oil, their small flames trembling against the walls. Families moved more slowly now, speaking in hushed tones, performing the final rituals of the day, washing a child's hands, setting out clothes for morning, banking the fire so that some warmth might last until dawn. The world outside no longer pressed so hard upon them. Only the creak of wood and the sigh of wind through loose boards reminded them that the night was cold and vast. In rural places darkness was thicker, almost complete. Without city light or electricity, the horizon dissolved into shadow, and a farmhouse window glowing faintly in the distance became the only mark of human life. Animals settled in their stalls, the fields turned silver under the moon, and the air carried the smell of earth cooling after long labor. People spoke less, perhaps because there was little to say that had not already been said 1,000 times before. For many, reading by lamplight was a small comfort. Newspapers arrived days late, and their pages, filled with distant events, were read slowly, almost ceremonially, as if words could stretch the evening a little longer. Others preferred to sit in silence, hands folded, eyes half closed, listening to the faint hiss of the lamp or the ticking of a clock that marked each second with patient indifference. Sleep came gradually, not abruptly as in modern nights. First came stillness, then the slowing of thought, and finally the quiet surrender of exhaustion. Children drifted first, their breathing soft and even. Adults lay awake longer, their minds lingering on unpaid bills, broken tools, the small hopes for tomorrow's weather. In the darkness, dreams were simple things of good harvests, steady work, of warmth that lasted through winter. And while some might have thought the night uneventful, it carried its own kind of life. A baby crying somewhere down the street, a dog barking at the moon, the faint clang of metal from a far-off train echoing across the valley. These sounds wove together into a low, steady hum that belonged only to that time, to that slower world. Soon lamps were extinguished one by one, leaving behind the scent of burnt oil and the comfort of near silence. Beds creaked as bodies turned and settled. Outside, frost began to form on windows, drawing delicate white patterns that would melt with the first light of morning. And in that long winter darkness, America slept, tired, hopeful, unaware of the new century quietly approaching, hidden just beyond the horizon of 1888. Morning returned not with sunlight at first, but with sound, before the pale light had even touched the rooftops. A distant factory whistle pierced the grey air, calling men and women from their beds, as though the world itself demanded their presence. The floorboards were cold beneath bare feet. A small fire had to be coaxed back to life. Embers stirred until they glowed, smoke rising lazily through the chimney, while the first movements of the day began in silence. There was no luxury in these mornings. The water was cold, drawn from wells or pumps that groaned with the strain of iron against ice. Breakfast was plain, bread, perhaps some porridge, maybe bacon if luck or pay had been kind, and it was eaten quickly without conversation because time was already running ahead, and no one could afford to let it slip. Outside, the streets were still half asleep, coated in frost or dust depending on the season, yet people moved through them with purpose, wrapped in layers of woolen worn coats, their breath clouding the air. Horses stamped their hooves impatiently as wagons creaked to life, and from distant yards came the hiss and thump of steam engines awakening, the mechanical heartbeats of an age that would not stop to wait for anyone. In the countryside, dawn carried a different rhythm. Farmers rose before light, the smell of hay and earth already in their lungs, the sound of roosters echoing across fields still hidden in mist. Frost cracked underfoot as they stepped outside to feed animals, to break the ice on water troughs, to begin the long day of tending to a land that never truly rested. Women in these early hours moved through their own silent routines, lighting lamps, kneading dough, sweeping ashes, waking children, their motions as practiced and precise as the ticking of a clock. The world depended on such motions, though few ever noticed them. The rhythm of life was built not from grand gestures, but from the quiet, unseen labor that began again every morning, without applause or reward. By mid-morning, America was fully awake. Trains thundered through towns with smoke curling behind them, shop doors opened, factory windows filled with movement, and the smell of coal and iron drifted through every street. Telegraph wires hummed faintly overhead, carrying messages across vast distances that no ordinary person would ever see. It was a world caught between centuries, still half in the age of horses and hand tools, yet already rushing towards something faster, brighter, more uncertain. And beneath it all, the people of 1888 moved steadily through their days, each step heavy but sure, their world smaller perhaps than ours, yet no less alive. Life in that year was not easy, nor was it fair, but it was tangible and immediate. Every breath was earned, every meal prepared by hand, every moment built from effort. As the morning sun climbed higher, illuminating brick and wood, smoke and sky, it touched millions of faces, each one part of the quiet machinery that kept a nation alive. And though history would rarely remember their names, it was these ordinary mornings, repeated endlessly across towns and farms, that truly defined what it meant to live in 1888 America. By the time the sun stood fully above the rooftops, America was already in motion. The hum of life spread outward from every corner, from the clang of streetcar rails to the rhythmic pulse of hammers on iron, from the hiss of steam escaping factory valves to the low murmur of thousands of voices, blending into the steady breathing of a nation at work. Factories were the lungs of the industrial city. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil, smoke, and sweat, and the great machines turned endlessly, their belts snapping, gears grinding, pistons pounding in a relentless mechanical chorus. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, faces smeared with soot, eyes half closed from the sting of dust, their movements so familiar they could work almost blindfolded. Time there did not move by hours but by repetition. 1,000 screws tightened, 1,000 levers pulled, the mind dissolving into rhythm to escape the monotony. Outside, streets filled with wagons carrying goods from those same factories, bolts of cloth, crates of glass, barrels of nails, all bound for distant places. Horses strained against the weight, drivers shouted over the noise, and children darted between wheels to deliver messages or fetch food for their parents. The air was alive, heavy with motion, and the city seemed to breathe and sweat and sigh, as though it were a single living body made of brick, iron, and willpower. In rural America, the world moved differently but no less intensely. The creak of wagon axles echoed across dirt roads as farmers hauled tools to the fields, and the sharp smell of freshly turned soil mixed with the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. There were no machines to drown out the sounds of nature, only the rhythm of a scythe slicing through wheat, the low mooing of cattle, the squeak of leather harness, and the occasional faraway bark of a dog. Work began with the rising light and did not stop until the last ember faded from the hearth. For women, the workday had no clear boundaries at all. Even when the men left for the fields or factories, the labor inside the home continued without pause. The endless circle of washing, sewing, sweeping, cooking, and caring for the young or the sick. Every movement was a small act of endurance, repeated so often it became invisible. Yet beneath that repetition lived a quiet strength, a sense of pride in survival itself, in making something warm and human out of a world built from struggle. Children, too, lived within this rhythm. Some ran errands for pennies, others worked in mills where their small hands could fit between moving parts. They learned early how to listen for danger, to step lightly, to obey orders without question. School, when it existed, was brief and fragile, a short season of learning before the realities of necessity pulled them elsewhere. Still, in stolen moments they played, running through streets or fields with the kind of laughter that cut briefly through the heaviness of the age, a reminder that even in hardship childhood refused to vanish entirely. By midday, the light had changed. It grew harsh, almost metallic, glinting off windows and plough blades alike, and the city shimmered in waves of heat from the furnaces and the cobblestones. Workers ate their meals sitting on crates or stoops, their hands blackened but steady, their eyes half focused on nothing at all. The food was simple: bread, cheese, an apple if one could afford it, but it tasted of rest, of silence, of the brief, sacred pause between effort and exhaustion. And then, as quickly as it began, the pause ended. Whistles blew again. Tools lifted. The rhythm resumed. The machinery of 1888 America continued to turn, powered not by steam or coal alone, but by millions of human lives, each one moving in perfect, weary synchrony with the rest. By late afternoon, the world began to soften again. The sun no longer blazed but hung lower, spilling light through the haze of factory smoke, gilding the roofs and the rails, and the weary faces of people making their way home. The day, which had started with discipline and noise, now loosened its grip. Conversations grew slower, footsteps heavier, and the air, though still thick with the scent of coal and horses, seemed calmer somehow, as if even the city itself was ready to exhale. Shops closed their shutters one by one. The metallic clatter of work gave way to the wooden sound of carts returning to stables, of tools being put away, of doors closing against the chill that crept in with dusk. Men walked home with the stiffness of bodies worn down by repetition, their coats smelling faintly of oil and iron, their thoughts drifting to the small meal waiting for them, to the comfort of light and warmth inside a modest room. In homes across the nation, stoves were lit again. The sound of kindling catching fire mixed with the soft bubbling of pots, the low hum of conversation, the cry of a child too tired to eat. Women moved quietly between tasks, setting tables, wiping flour from their hands, speaking softly so as not to disturb the fragile peace of the evening. Theirs was a labor invisible to history, but it was the labor that made every other kind possible. As darkness spread, windows began to glow like small constellations across towns and valleys. Families gathered around lamps or hearths, their faces illuminated by the flicker of flame, their shadows swaying gently on the walls. Some read aloud from old books, others mended clothes, or simply sat in silence listening to the faint whistle of the wind outside. Conversation was practical, unhurried, about weather, prices, neighbors, the small, unremarkable details that made up an entire life. Outside the cities, in rural towns and scattered farmsteads, night descended with more finality. The world became very still, broken only by the distant bark of a dog or the faint creak of a barn door in the wind. The stars overhead were clear and endless, and those who stepped outside to fetch wood or look toward the horizon felt the deep, almost holy quiet that only existed before electricity stretched the day into perpetual light. Children were sent to bed first, tucked beneath heavy quilts, their eyes half closed even before their heads met the pillow. Parents stayed awake a little longer, their bodies too tired for talk, their minds too full of what tomorrow might bring. A new storm, a late payment, another 12 hours of work. They didn't call it exhaustion. They simply called it life. In the distance, trains continued to move through the darkness, their whistles echoing over the sleeping land like ghostly songs, a reminder that the world was changing even now, that somewhere far beyond the lamplight, a new century was already forming, preparing to sweep away this slow and fragile rhythm of existence. And still, inside those quiet houses, people lay down and closed their eyes. The sound of the wind against the window, the smell of smoke in their hair, the small ache of a day well spent pressing gently against their thoughts. Sleep came not suddenly but like the tide, a slow, inevitable drift into the dark comfort of rest. Beneath the quiet rhythm of those nights, when the lamps had gone out and the wind slipped through the seams of every wooden wall, there existed another America, one that could not be seen in daylight, because it lived in thoughts, in memories, in the small secret hopes that people carried quietly within themselves. The world of 1888 looked still on the surface, but inside the minds of its people it was restless, filled with longing and worry and the fragile faith that tomorrow might somehow be kinder. Many dreamed of better things, though the word better meant something different to each. For the factory worker, it was a steady job that didn't injure the hands or lungs. For the farmer, it was a harvest unspoiled by drought or frost. For a mother, it was a child who had lived past infancy, who might one day see a future larger than the narrow horizon of her own life. And for the young, the apprentices, the newsboys, the girls sewing in cramped boarding houses, the dream was not of wealth, but simply of freedom, of choosing their own hours and breathing clean air for once. Hope in those years was a quiet thing. It did not shout, it did not demand. It whispered in the stillness of the night, in the soft murmur of prayer, in the sound of rain on the roof, reminding people that even in a hard world, the heart could still imagine gentleness. Faith, whether in God, in progress, or in simple endurance, was the invisible thread that held everything together. People prayed not only in churches, but in kitchens, in barns, in tenement rooms that smelled of smoke and soap, trusting that someone or something was listening, even if the world did not seem to change. There was fear, too. The fear of sickness that could sweep through a household in a single week. The fear of injury that might end a life's work in a moment. The fear of debt, of hunger, of cold. Yet fear in 1888 had no loud voice. It lived in silence, in the glances exchanged across dinner tables, in the tightening of a hand around a child's shoulder, in the way people avoided speaking of what could not be fixed. Still, even that fear was a kind of faith, a belief that life was worth protecting. When people dreamed, their dreams carried the texture of their days. Some dreamed of open fields and clean rivers, others of cities filled with light that never dimmed, of trains that ran farther and faster, of machines that worked without breaking the body. It was an age of imagination as much as endurance, for though their hands were calloused and their backs bent, their minds often reached toward a future they would never live to see, an America that was still being built, piece by piece, through their labor and their hope. And so, in the small hours before dawn, when even the last lamps had gone dark, there were moments of stillness so deep that it seemed the entire nation held its breath. The wind paused. The clocks ticked softly. Somewhere, a baby cried and was hushed. And then, before anyone truly noticed, the darkness began to lift, faint and grey and familiar. A new day was already waiting. Another morning of work and motion and small mercies. And though the people of 1888 could not see what lay ahead, they rose again because that was what life demanded, and because beneath all the fatigue and fear, there was something stubborn and bright that refused to die. The belief that existence itself, no matter how hard, was still worth living. The world of 1888 was balanced on the edge of transformation, though few living in that year could have sensed it clearly. Change was not something that announced itself with noise or light. It crept forward in small inventions, in the faint hum of electricity beginning to flicker through city streets, in the strange sight of a telephone sitting on a desk, or a light bulb glowing behind a shop window long after the sun had gone down. People paused to stare at such things with quiet wonder, not realizing that they were witnessing the birth of a new rhythm of time. In large cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, progress was beginning to hum beneath the surface, rail lines stretching outward, steel rising toward the sky, news traveling faster than footsteps could carry it. There was a new kind of motion in the air, faster and more insistent, as though the century itself was impatient to begin. The sound of horses still filled the streets, but somewhere far away a man was testing an automobile engine. A few spoke of airplanes, and others of great machines that could power entire neighborhoods. These were still dreams, but they were dreams that had begun to take shape. Rural America watched this from a distance, half curious and half fearful. For the farmer whose hands had known only plows and soil, the talk of machines and factories sounded like another language, a promise of ease that could also mean the end of everything familiar. Yet even there, the pull of progress could be felt. New tools arrived, new seeds, new ways of connecting to distant markets by telegraph and train. The old pace of life, measured by sun and season, began to bend towards something quicker, less patient, more mechanical. And through all of it, people continued their quiet routines, unaware that the world was already leaving the 19th century behind. They still carried lanterns to the barn at night, still sat by the fire to mend and read, still slept beneath quilts heavy with years of use. But just beyond the horizon lay a future filled with electric light, elevators, and voices traveling through invisible wires. The world that had once seemed solid and predictable was beginning to shimmer, to vibrate with invisible energy. There was excitement in that change, but unease as well. Some saw it as a blessing, others as a quiet betrayal of something older and truer. In tenements and parlors alike, people wondered if this new age would bring comfort or confusion, whether the machines would serve them or replace them, whether the human heart could still keep pace with the iron one being built in its place. But even as the century turned, one truth remained steady. Every morning still began with the same rituals: water heated, bread broken, hands cleaned and folded before work. Every night still ended with the same exhaustion, the same soft prayers whispered into darkness. The inventions might change, but the essence of life, the need for warmth, for food, for hope, endured untouched. And so, in the final years of the 19th century, as electric lights began to outshine the stars and the first photographs captured faces that would outlive their owners, America drifted quietly from one age into another. It did not feel like a revolution. It felt like a slow turning of the earth, like the sound of a clock moving one step closer to a new hour. People kept on living, as they always had, uncertain of what was coming, but unwilling to stop. Somewhere in the quiet hum of progress, in the distant whistle of a train disappearing into the dark, the story of 1888 began to fade, giving way to another story, one faster, brighter, and entirely new. The dawn of the new century did not come with trumpets or celebration for most people. It arrived quietly, as all mornings do, with pale light touching the roofs of cities and the frozen fields of distant farms. The year had changed, but life looked almost the same, though underneath the familiar shapes of things, something vast and irreversible had already begun. By 1900, America had started to glow. Electric lights shimmered along main streets where gas lamps once burned, their white brilliance cutting through fog and coal smoke like something almost supernatural. In the cities, people stopped to stare at them with awe, a light that never dimmed, that ignored night itself. Children watched the new streetcars glide by without horses, their wheels whispering against metal tracks, their motion so smooth it seemed unnatural. The age of steam was giving way to the age of current, and though no one could see it, the world now pulsed with invisible rivers of energy flowing through wires and walls. Factories worked longer hours, no longer bound to daylight. Men and women labored under bright lamps that turned night into endless afternoon. The pace of life quickened. Machines became stronger, faster, louder. Products multiplied, cities grew upward and outward until their skylines looked like forests of iron. The new century was impatient, restless, alive with ambition. But the people who built it were still the same weary hands that had shaped the world of 1888. Immigrants arrived by the thousands, their ships crowding the harbors of New York and Boston, bringing with them languages, songs, and hopes that mixed into the growing hum of America. They found work wherever there was smoke, in mills, foundries, and workshops. And though they faced long hours and hard treatment, their presence changed everything. Streets filled with new faces, bakeries with new smells, neighborhoods with new sounds. The country was becoming something broader, louder, more complicated, and far more alive. In rural towns, the transformation moved slower but no less surely. Telegraph wires traced their way along the horizon, connecting even the loneliest farms to the voices of distant cities. Newspapers arrived sooner. Trains brought goods that once took weeks to reach, and with them came ideas, advertisements for machines, medicines, and marvels that promised to make life easier, though they rarely did. People began to speak differently too. Words like modern and progress entered daily conversation. There was a belief that the world was moving forward, that humanity itself was on the verge of perfection. Yet beneath that optimism ran a quiet undercurrent of unease, a sense that something precious was slipping away, that in the race towards speed and brilliance, the simplicity of the past might be lost forever. Still, life went on in its ordinary beauty. Families gathered at dinner tables lit by electric bulbs instead of candles, unaware that they were living through one of history's greatest shifts. A mother's hand still guided a child's, a father still measured the weather with his eyes, neighbors still greeted each other at dawn. The human heart had not changed, even if everything around it had. As the century awakened fully, the America of 1888 seemed to recede like a dream at the edge of memory. A quieter, slower, dimmer world, yet one whose pulse could still be felt beneath the modern roar. It lived in the rhythm of footsteps on old cobblestones, in the scent of coal on winter air, in the faded photographs tucked inside drawers. The old world was not gone. It had simply transformed, hidden under the glittering surface of progress, waiting for those who cared enough to remember. And somewhere, in that vast country of light and motion, a few still did remember the feel of morning frost before the furnace was lit, the sound of wagons in the street before the first motor car passed, the taste of bread baked by hand. They remembered not because they wished to return, but because memory itself was a kind of home, a quiet refuge in a century that would never again be still. History has a way of whispering rather than shouting. It lingers in the quiet corners of memory, in the small, forgotten gestures that once filled ordinary days. The world of 1888 is long gone. Yet when we close our eyes, it is not so distant after all. We can still imagine the weight of a wooden door creaking open to the dawn, the smell of bread baking slowly in an iron stove, the muffled thud of boots on unpaved streets. Time has moved forward, yes, but pieces of that slower, humbler rhythm still live quietly within us. The America of that year was not a place of comfort or leisure. It was a land of constant effort, of aching backs and calloused hands, of cold mornings and smoky nights. Yet it was also a world of resilience, of people who found beauty not in wealth but in endurance, who measured success not by what they owned, but by what they could carry through another day. There was dignity in survival, poetry in persistence, grace in repetition. Today, when lights burn without pause and machines never sleep, it is easy to forget how precious quiet once was, how valuable a single moment of stillness could feel after hours of noise and motion. The people of 1888 understood that silence was not emptiness, it was rest. It was the space where thought could breathe, where faith could take root, where love could show itself in simple, wordless ways. If we could walk through those streets now, we would not find monuments or heroes. We would find laundry hanging between brick buildings, a mother humming to her child, the steady beat of a blacksmith's hammer, the sigh of a farmer leaning on his shovel as dusk gathers. We would find a country that believed, even in hardship, that the next morning would come, and that life, however difficult, was still a gift worth waking to. And perhaps that is what remains most of all, the quiet lesson of their endurance, the idea that progress, for all its brightness, means little without gratitude, that the smallest gestures, the lighting of a lamp, the breaking of bread, the act of rest after labor, carry the weight of meaning far greater than invention or wealth. So when the modern world hums too loudly, when days blur into each other beneath the glare of constant light, it helps to remember them, the people who rose in the dark, who worked until their bodies gave out, who built a nation not from speed but from patience. Their lives were not glamorous, but they were whole. They lived with their hands, their hearts, and their hope. And that hope, more than any machine or discovery, is what endures. And as the night settles once more, and the hum of the present fades into a softer silence, the spirit of 1888 still drifts through the quiet, gentle, unhurried, eternal, reminding us that the simplest things have always been enough. The night in 1888 did not end so much as dissolve into quiet. The glow of the lamps dimmed, the air cooled, and the last sounds of movement softened until only the faint ticking of a clock and the slow breath of sleepers remained. The city beyond was hushed now, its smoke drifting lazily above rooftops, its streets slick with moonlight and silence. Out in the countryside, the frost crept across the fields, covering everything in a thin silver glaze, and the wind whispered through barn doors left slightly ajar. Inside the houses, the world had grown smaller, just the flicker of the hearth, the soft creak of wood as it cooled, the gentle rhythm of a body turning in bed. Somewhere, a baby stirred and was hushed. Somewhere else, a man coughed softly in his sleep. These sounds were all that was left of the day, and they seemed to belong to the darkness itself, like the steady heartbeat of time passing unnoticed. And though the lamps had been blown out, faint traces of light lingered, the memory of fire, the afterglow of warmth, the invisible shimmer that clings to everything once touched by care. It was in that half-light that thoughts continued to wander. People dreamt of the next morning, of work and weather, of letters to be written, or debts to be paid. They dreamt, too, of better things they could not name, of comfort, of peace, of something beyond the constant turning of the days. Out there, beyond the sleeping streets and quiet farms, the great engine of the world still moved. Trains crossed the dark plains, carrying letters, goods, and stories between towns that barely knew each other. Somewhere in the distance, a telegraph clicked softly in an empty station. Somewhere, a factory chimney still smoked against the moon. The world was never entirely still, only slower, quieter, as if catching its breath before the next dawn. And so the night stretched on, long, patient, alive in its stillness, waiting for morning to return, for the first whistle to sound again, for the world of 1888 to awaken once more. Before dawn in 1888, the world existed in a kind of suspended silence, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. The stars still burned faintly above the rooftops, their pale light mingling with the last wisps of smoke that drifted from chimneys left smouldering through the night. The streets were empty, damp with dew, their cobblestones glistening faintly in the moonlight. Even the horses in their stables stood motionless, eyes half closed, bodies steaming gently in the cold air. Inside, the warmth of sleep lingered. Beads creaked softly as people turned, half dreaming, caught between the fading comfort of the night and the slow approach of responsibility. It was the most fragile hour, that narrow space where darkness had not yet given up its hold, and light had not yet claimed the sky. Fires had burned down to embers. The world was waiting, hushed and weightless, like a held note that had not yet been released. Some were already awake. Bakers rose before the first hint of dawn, their hands white with flour, kneading dough by candlelight. Milkmen moved through the streets, their footsteps muffled on the wet stone, bottles clinking softly in rhythm with the breath of the morning. In the rail yards, the first locomotives began to stir, metal groaning as heat crept through their engines. Far to the east, a faint streak of blue began to touch the horizon. For most, though, the hour remained sacred. It was the only true quiet they would ever know, the moment before obligation, before work and motion, before the endless noise of the day reclaimed them. In that hour, dreams were still close enough to touch. A mother might rest a hand on her child's shoulder, feeling the rise and fall of breath. A man might lie still, eyes open, thinking not of labor, but of something gentler, the scent of rain, the sound of wind in trees, the small mercy of another morning promised. The air smelled of iron and ash, of bread baking somewhere unseen, of cold earth waking beneath frost. And then, just as the silence began to feel eternal, a rooster crowed, one sound sharp and solitary cutting through the hush. Others followed. A door opened. A match struck. The world began to move again, slowly, cautiously, as if remembering itself. Windows glowed faintly with lamplight. Smoke began to rise once more from chimneys. The faint murmur of voices stirred behind walls. Somewhere, a child cried out and was soothed. Somewhere, a factory whistle pierced the last of the night. The slow machinery of morning began to turn, and with it, the people of 1888 stirred from their dreams into another day that would look much like the one before. The same work, the same hunger, the same small moments of grace scattered among the hours. But for now the light was still soft, the world still gentle. The dawn had come quietly, not as a burst, but as a slow unfurling, a hand opening, a sigh released, a new page turning without a sound, and somewhere in that faint grey light, America took its first breath of morning once again. The first sunlight of 1888 did not arrive suddenly. It crept slowly over the horizon, spilling in quiet ribbons of gold that turned chimney smoke into pale silk drifting through the air. The world seemed to stretch and yawn beneath its touch. Roofs glimmered faintly with dew, windows brightened, and the dark corners of rooms dissolved into gentle colour. Morning had come again, not with ceremony or noise, but with the same patient inevitability that guided everything in those days. In the cities, the streets stirred first. Doors opened onto narrow alleys, and the sound of broom bristles swept the cobblestones clean of yesterday's dust. Vendors rolled their carts from shadowed storage rooms, the wheels creaking as they filled them with fruit, bread, or scraps of printed paper. The cries of morning trade began softly, a butcher calling out prices, a milkman knocking at a door, the echo of a church bell marking the hour. The city's heartbeat was returning, one sound at a time. The smell of coffee drifted through the air, dark, strong, and grounding. For many it was the first comfort of the day, a small pause before motion. Steam rose from tin cups held between calloused hands. A man adjusted his collar and hat in the window reflection before stepping into the street. A woman tied her apron and checked the bread in the oven. Children hurried with lunches wrapped in paper, the early cold reddening their cheeks as they followed their parents' steady pace toward the day's beginning. Far from the cities, the countryside awoke in softer tones. Cows lowed in the fields, and chickens scattered across the yard as farmers opened barn doors heavy with frost. The smell of hay mixed with the damp scent of earth and the faint sweetness of wood smoke. The sky there was larger, quieter, its colour shifting from grey to pale amber as the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon. A man bent to lift water from a well, droplets shining like glass in the early light. Somewhere a dog barked once, then settled into silence again. Everywhere life unfolded without hurry, but without pause. The rhythm was ancient, unchanged. Stoves lit, fires fed, bodies set into motion. It was the hour when thought gave way to habit, when movement replaced reflection, when all the small actions of survival wove together into the invisible fabric of a day. There was no sense of history in these moments. The people of 1888 did not think of themselves as living in the past. They thought only of the work ahead, the weather, the sound of their own breath in the cold air. Yet from the distance of another century, it is easy to see the beauty in that unthinking routine, the grace of repetition, the poetry of tasks done with care even when no one was watching. As the sun climbed higher, the mist lifted from the streets and fields, and the world brightened into motion. The voices of the morning rose together. Footsteps, laughter, iron striking stone, the turning of wheels, a familiar symphony of human persistence. Another day had begun, ordinary and unremarkable, yet entirely sacred in its simplicity. And so, once again, America moved forward. The lamps of the night were gone, replaced by sunlight warming the brick, the earth, and the skin of those who walked beneath it. The day was young, and though it looked like every day before, within its quiet beginning lay everything that life in 1888 had ever been: hard, humble, and profoundly alive. By mid-morning, the pulse of the day had fully returned, spreading outward like the tide. The hum of movement filled every space, boots on wooden floors, wheels turning over cobblestone, the faint clang of metal somewhere far off. The sun, higher now, shone across rooftops and fields alike, gilding the ordinary with a quiet kind of majesty. It was the hour when the world of 1888 belonged wholly to those who laboured within it. Men, women and children bound together by the rhythm of necessity. In the city, the factories had awakened in full. Steam hissed through iron pipes, great gears spun with slow, deliberate power, belts rattled and sang in the heavy air. The noise was relentless, but within that noise was order, a strange mechanical harmony built from repetition and endurance. Men stood at their stations, bodies bent and shining with sweat, moving with a precision learned through years of sameness. It was not joy that drove them, but a deep understanding that life could only continue through motion. The women who worked inside these walls were no less vital to the machinery of the age. They stitched, pressed, packed and sorted until their fingers burned and their eyes blurred from the fine work. Around them, the air smelled of oil and fabric, of iron and damp heat. They spoke softly to one another between the clatter of machines, sharing small fragments of conversation, a joke, a memory, a worry about the rent. Their voices were fragile but steady, carrying warmth through the hard rhythm of the day. Outside, in the bright, cold light, the city carried on with its endless exchanges. Shop doors swung open, bakeries displayed their morning loaves, the streetcars glided past, their bells chiming faintly above the crowd. A policeman walked his route with slow, measured steps. Boys shouted headlines from newspapers still smelling of ink. Horses tossed their heads and stamped as wagons jostled for space. To stand and watch was to see a living organism, the city breathing, sweating, speaking, endlessly creating itself anew. Farther away, the farms were no quieter. Beneath the blue sky, the air shimmered faintly with heat rising from freshly ploughed earth. Men moved in long, steady lines, the handles of their ploughs shining with use. The ground gave off the scent of soil and labour, of something ancient and enduring. Children carried water or gathered eggs, their laughter faint but clear across the open space. Women worked at laundry lines, white sheets snapping in the wind like bright sails on a calm sea. There was wonder in this work, though few had the time to name it. It lived in the simple fact that so much could be created by hand: bread baked in iron ovens, clothes stitched from coarse thread, tools shaped from raw wood and steel. Every object bore the touch of someone's labour, the faint trace of care pressed into its form. The people of 1888 might have lived with less, but what they had carried the mark of their existence in a way no machine could yet imitate. And when one stopped to listen, truly listen, there was music in it all. The rhythm of saws, the murmur of voices, the far-off whistle of a train cutting through distance. It was not a beautiful sound by intention, but by truth, the sound of a world alive with purpose, imperfect yet whole. As the day climbed toward noon, the light grew harsher, brighter, casting sharp shadows through factory windows and across ploughed fields. The smell of smoke hung thick in the air, mingling with dust and sweat and the faint sweetness of bread cooling on a sill. The morning's promise had hardened now into labour, and everywhere, from the crowded heart of the city to the loneliest patch of farmland, the people of 1888 worked on, not thinking of history or progress, but only of the next hour, the next task, the next breath. And yet, beneath all the noise, beneath all the effort, something quiet remained. A small, unspoken awareness that life, for all its difficulty, carried a kind of sacredness when lived so completely. Every motion, every sound, every heartbeat was part of something vast and ongoing, a story that had begun long before them and would continue long after they were gone. The day brightened, and still they worked, unaware that in the eyes of the future this ordinary labour would come to seem almost holy. By noon, the energy that had filled the morning began to soften. The clang and hum of the world dulled into something slower, steadier, as if even the great engines of labour needed to draw breath. The sunlight was white and high now, pouring down on rooftops, fields, and faces alike. Shadows shrank beneath wagons and walls, and for a brief, suspended hour, America in 1888 exhaled. The factory whistles signaled the midday break, their echoes bouncing across brick alleys and narrow streets. Workers stepped out into the light, blinking like people emerging from another world. The air smelled of iron and smoke and bread. The pavement radiated heat. Men sat on curbs or crates, wiping their foreheads with coarse handkerchiefs, unwrapping lunches carried from home, bread thick with butter, cold potatoes, apples, slices of meat wrapped in paper. There was little talking at first, only the rhythm of eating, the quiet sound of breathing mixed with the murmur of the city still alive around them. In shaded doorways, women rested their feet for the first time since dawn. Some removed their aprons, their fingers red and sore from washing or sewing. A few shared water from a tin pail or exchanged brief, knowing glances that said more than words could. A silent acknowledgement of exhaustion, of endurance, of the strange pride in simply keeping pace with the day. The streets themselves seemed to slow. Horses stood still, heads lowered. A newspaper boy leaned against a lamp post, fanning himself with his cap. Farther away in open fields, farmers paused beside their ploughs and shaded their eyes against the glare. They stood silently for a while, watching the air shimmer above the earth, listening to the faint buzz of insects that filled the space where voices had fallen quiet. For this short time, everything balanced delicately between labor and rest. It was the hour when life seemed to stop just long enough to be felt. The taste of water drawn from a well, the warmth of sunlight on the back of one's neck, the sound of a breeze moving through the branches. It was not peace in the grand sense, but it was something close, a small, hard-earned stillness that belonged only to those who worked. In the kitchens of homes and boarding houses, the air grew warm with the smell of soup and bread. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces shiny with heat, sharing what little there was to eat. A radio had not yet been invented to fill the silence, so people listened instead to the creak of chairs, the sigh of the wind through open windows, the ticking of a clock that seemed almost tender in its patience. For a few moments, the world was gentle. The factories loomed silently, their doors open but their machines stilled. Even the smoke from the chimneys hung thin and pale, as though reluctant to rise. The land, the people, the noise, all seemed to rest together, held in a rare and fragile harmony. And then, just as quietly as it began, the pause was over. A whistle blew again, shrill, commanding, and bodies rose in unison, gathering their tools, tying their aprons, returning to motion. The sound of industry swelled once more, a slow heartbeat returning to its rhythm. The brief stillness of noon was gone, replaced by the steady momentum of the afternoon. Yet the pause left something behind, a faint sweetness in the air, a reminder that even in a world built from labor, rest still existed, however fleeting. And as the day lengthened and the shadows began to stretch again, that small memory of calm carried people forward, quietly toward the long hours yet to come. As the hours after noon unfolded, the world began to feel heavier again. The sunlight that had once seemed pure and kind now pressed down like a weight, filling every space with heat. The city shimmered faintly under a pale haze. Smoke from 1,000 chimneys curled upward and hung in the air, reluctant to drift away. For the people of 1888, the long afternoon was a test of endurance, not dramatic, not loud, but slow and absolute. Inside the factories, the air thickened until it felt almost solid. The smell of oil and metal grew stronger, and the steady rhythm of machines, so hypnotic in the morning, began to wear on the nerves. Each repetition of motion, the lifting, the tightening, the pushing, became more difficult as fatigue set in. Sweat darkened collars, hands trembled slightly, and voices, when they rose, were short and clipped, not from anger but from the sheer effort of keeping focus. Out on the streets, the same heat lay over everything. Horses labored against it, their breath visible, their coats glistening. Shopkeepers stood in doorways, fanning themselves with scraps of newspaper. Children's laughter sounded distant, thinned by exhaustion. Time itself seemed to slow, each minute stretching like taffy, refusing to break, refusing to let the day move forward. In the countryside, the rhythm was no gentler. The fields that had looked so alive in the morning now shimmered under the fierce sun. Farmers bent low over their tools, faces hidden beneath wide hats, their movements slow and precise, conserving energy with the instinct of those who had learned how to live with the land. The air was alive with sound, the drone of insects, the call of crows circling above, the soft crunch of boots on dry soil. Women in houses and washrooms continued their quiet labor, stirring pots, wringing out sheets, sweeping dust that returned no matter how often it was swept. They paused at windows now and then, staring at the hard white sky, letting their hands rest for a few seconds before returning to work. A kind of reverence grew in these pauses, not for beauty, but for stillness, the rare gift of simply stopping in a world that never stopped. By mid-afternoon, a drowsy weariness had settled everywhere. The city's pulse slowed, its sounds merging into one continuous hum. In the distance, a train whistle rose, long, low, mournful, echoing through the haze like the sigh of something vast and mechanical. It reminded everyone, consciously or not, that the day was still far from over, that there were hours yet to fill before rest could return. The light outside grew richer, more golden, but it carried no softness yet. It revealed every detail: dust swirling in sunbeams, beads of sweat on a brow, the thin shadow of a hand moving across a desk. The world was beautiful in its exhaustion, glowing from within with the strange dignity of endurance. And as the clock hands crawled toward evening, people began to feel that familiar pull, the quiet yearning for release, for the whistle that would signal the end of work, for the moment when motion could finally stop. But the day was not ready to yield. It held them still a little longer, stretching the hours, reminding them that in 1888, rest was never given freely. It had to be earned. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, and the golden light thickened into amber, coating the walls, the rails, the tired faces of those who still labored beneath it. Somewhere in that warmth and fatigue, there was a kind of grace, the strange, silent grace of people who kept going simply because there was no other choice. And the world, watching itself through that fading light, seemed to breathe in deeply and wait for the mercy of dusk. By the time the sun began to fall, the light had changed completely. The harsh brightness of afternoon gave way to a softer gold that slipped across rooftops and through factory windows, settling on everything like a slow breath. The edges of the world began to blur again. Dust hung in the air like smoke, glowing faintly before fading into shadow. The long day had started to fold in on itself, and people could feel it, that slow unwinding of hours that meant the hardest part was finally over. The last whistle of the factories came first, sharp and distant, its echo drifting through the haze. One by one, the great machines began to slow, their clattering rhythm easing into silence. The sound of labor, the hammering, the grinding, the endless thrum, fell away, leaving behind an almost startling quiet. For a few moments, all that could be heard was the hiss of steam cooling, the scrape of boots on stone, the soft sigh of doors closing. Men stepped out into the open air, blinking at the light as if seeing the sky for the first time that day. Their faces were streaked with sweat and soot. Their hands carried the deep ache of hours spent in repetition. Yet in their weariness there was something steady, something that looked almost like peace. They walked home slowly, speaking little, their movements deliberate as though the body itself refused to hurry any longer. The city began its transformation. Smoke from chimneys mixed with the scent of cooking. Lamplighters moved through the streets, their long poles lifting small flames into glass globes that flickered to life one by one. Carts rolled home empty, their wheels clattering softly. Shopkeepers swept their thresholds and counted coins under the dim light of oil lamps. Above them, the sky deepened from gold to amber, then to violet, until only a narrow band of light remained along the horizon. In the countryside, the change came with different sounds: the creak of a gate, the rustle of animals settling in their stalls, the metallic clang of a bucket lowered into a well. Women called children in from the fields, their voices softened by distance. The scent of smoke and bread drifted across the open air. Inside the homes of 1888, the evening rituals began again, quiet and familiar. Fires were rekindled. Bread was cut. Hands were washed in cool water drawn from wells. Supper was eaten slowly, in silence or in soft conversation beneath the warm, trembling glow of a single lamp. There were no distractions, no hum of wires, no flicker of screens, only the steady rhythm of human voices, the scrape of cutlery, the rustle of fabric as someone shifted in their chair. Outside, the first stars appeared, faint and scattered. The air cooled, and the wind changed direction, bringing with it the scent of distant rain. Children were put to bed, their eyes already half closed before they reached the pillow. Adults lingered a while longer, some reading by candlelight, some mending torn clothes, some simply sitting in the quiet, watching the flame dance and gutter. And above it all, the world darkened completely. The city became a scatter of small glowing windows. The fields turned to shadow, the hills vanished into the night. The noise of the day was gone, replaced by something gentler, the rustle of leaves, the low hum of crickets, the heartbeat of a world at rest. It was in this hour, more than any other, that 1888 revealed its soul, not in progress or invention, but in stillness, the kind of stillness that allowed people to feel the depth of their own existence, to hear the faint echo of their own thoughts, to know that even in weariness there was meaning. And as the last light finally disappeared, America sank once more into its vast and quiet night, the stars above it unchanging, the hum of life below it soft and steady, carrying on exactly as it always had. Night returned the way it always did, not as an ending, but as a slow descent, a soft erasing of detail. The last traces of sunlight slipped behind the horizon, and the world grew dim, painted now in greys and silvers. The smoke that had hung all day above the city dissolved into the darkness. Streets that had been filled with noise and motion only hours ago were now hushed, their stones glistening faintly beneath the lamps that lined them like small trembling stars. Windows glowed across the city, scattered and uneven, each one a tiny universe. Behind them were families finishing their suppers, workers washing soot from their hands, mothers rocking their children to sleep. The sound of laughter, low and tired, drifted through thin walls. A door creaked, a kettle whistled, a chair scraped gently across the floor. Small sounds, fragile and fleeting, yet they carried the weight of all that it meant to live. Outside, the air was cool and damp, smelling faintly of iron and rain. Horses clopped slowly through the streets, their breath rising in white plumes. Somewhere far away, a church bell rang, 1, 2, 3, then faded into the quiet. The sound seemed to hang in the air, soft as a memory. In the countryside, the night came deeper, darker. The sky stretched wide and unbroken, filled with stars that glimmered like frost. The fields were still, the trees black against the pale light of the moon. In farmhouses scattered across the land, lamps burned low, their glow spilling across wooden tables and sleeping faces. A dog barked once, and then lay down again. A barn door swung gently in the wind. The entire world seemed to breathe as one, slow, steady, at peace. Inside those homes the rituals of rest unfolded. Beds creaked as bodies sank into them. The faint rustle of quilts and the whisper of fabric marked the end of another day. There were no clocks bright enough to mark the hour, no electric glow to hold back the dark, only the sound of breathing, of quiet dreams gathering like mist across the room. Some stayed awake longer, watching the flame of a lamp dance in the still air. Their thoughts drifted to the small things that had filled the day, the coins earned, the meal shared, the work left unfinished. There was a melancholy comfort in it all, the sense that life was simple, finite, but deeply real. They did not think of history or of the world beyond their own, only of morning, and the certainty that it would come. Beyond the windows, the lamps along the streets began to dim, one by one, until the city lay half in darkness. The world seemed smaller now, just the narrow light of a candle, the soft murmur of a family settling, the quiet turning of a clock somewhere unseen. And in that stillness, the whole of 1888 seemed to exhale. The factories were silent, the fields asleep, the ships in their harbours rocking gently with the tide. The same stars that had watched over the birth of the nation now watched over its weary people, scattered and dreaming, their lives bound together by the shared rhythm of work, of hope, of rest. It was night again in America, the deep, unbroken kind of night that belonged only to the world before electricity, when darkness was not an absence but a presence, vast and soft and full of meaning. It pressed gently against every window, reminding the world to be still. And somewhere, in that infinite quiet, the first embers of tomorrow's dawn waited, silent, unseen, already beginning to glow. In the deep hours after midnight, when the lamps had burned to nothing, and even the embers in the hearth glowed faintly beneath their own ashes, America slept. The streets were hollow and silent, the air cool and sweet again after the day's smoke, and all that moved were the faint currents of wind between buildings, the sigh of wood settling, the soft rhythmic breathing of a country at rest. But within that quiet, behind every closed door and shuttered window, dreams were unfolding, a private world invisible to the waking eye. The people of 1888 did not dream of the future in grand shapes or bright colours. Their visions came in fragments, a field seen at dusk, a table laid for supper, a letter arriving from far away. For some, dreams returned them to the comfort of home, to parents long gone, or places that no longer existed. For others, dreams lifted them gently towards something they could not name, a whisper of peace, a flash of light, a feeling that life might one day be easier. The farmer dreamed of rain falling across his fields, soaking the soil until it smelled rich and alive again. The factory worker dreamed of quiet, a world where the machines stopped turning, and he could finally hear the wind outside. The mother dreamed of her children grown, strong and safe, free from hunger or illness. And somewhere, a child dreamed of cities he had never seen, of lights brighter than stars, of strange new machines that floated, flew and sang. Dreams were the only place where time softened its grip. There the walls of tenement rooms disappeared, the clatter of factories went silent, even the ache of muscles forgot itself. In sleep, every person became weightless, drifting through memory and hope, wandering through a landscape where loss was undone and fear dissolved into mist. Across the sleeping land, that quiet web of dreams stretched from ocean to ocean, binding the lonely miner in his bunk to the seamstress in her boarding house, the sailor in port to the preacher in his parsonage, the widow by her window to the newborn in his cradle. It was the unseen fellowship of rest, the shared heartbeat of a nation caught between exhaustion and becoming. Outside, the moon moved slowly over the rooftops, its light falling through thin curtains and onto faces turned towards sleep. The world it touched was still, a cradle of breath and memory. Somewhere a clock struck 3, its sound clear and hollow in the empty air. A dog barked once, then was silent again. Even the trains had grown quiet, their tracks cold and gleaming under starlight. And as the night deepened further, the dreams of the Republic turned toward morning. They began to fill with light, with the promise of motion, of awakening, of 1,000 small tasks waiting to be done. In those last, lingering hours before dawn, the people of 1888 dreamed themselves gently into tomorrow. They did not know they were shaping history simply by rising again, by enduring, by carrying their ordinary lives forward into the next day. The darkness, tender and infinite, held them close, and beneath it, faint and golden, the horizon began to stir once more. And then, almost imperceptibly, the darkness began to lift. The first faint grey light seeped across the horizon, brushing the edges of rooftops, sliding over the still water of rivers, revealing once more the familiar shapes of a sleeping world. The stars faded one by one, retreating into the pale morning sky. The lamps in windows had gone out hours ago, Yet the new day carried its own quiet glow, softer, older, as if the earth itself were remembering something it had always known. In that hush between night and day, before the whistles sounded and the streets stirred, the world of 1888 seemed perfectly still. It was the same hour as the day before, and yet it felt newly born, a fragile moment in which the past and future balanced on the edge of the present. The dreams that had carried people through the night lingered faintly in the air, hopes for rain, for food, for gentler years ahead. They clung to the light like dew before vanishing into the hum of waking life. A rooster crowed somewhere on the outskirts of town. A door opened with a wooden sigh. A match was struck. Thin smoke rose from chimneys, curling upward into the pale morning. The baker kneaded dough again. The blacksmith lifted his tools. The same hands, the same faces, the same tasks, yet there was beauty in the sameness, in the eternal return of ordinary life. For this was the quiet miracle of the age, that despite the toil, despite the cold and the hunger and the long hours, people rose again. They greeted the day not with triumph but with endurance, and in that endurance there was something sacred. The light grew warmer now, spilling across fields and windows, catching on the steel rails that ran like veins through the land. In the cities the noise began to rise once more, a door slamming, a horse snorting, a cart rolling forward, the first whistle of the morning shift cutting through the soft air. In the countryside, frost melted from fence posts, and the smell of damp earth returned. The country was waking again, patient, tireless, alive. And if you could stand there, at that hour, and look across America in 1888, from the sleeping farmhouses to the crowded city blocks, from the silent harbors to the open plains, you would see the same quiet light touching every face, every roof, every breath. It was not the light of glory or invention, but of simple human persistence, the glow of people who kept the world turning one small motion at a time. The day had begun again, as it always did. The great story of ordinary life continued, endless, beautiful, unremarkable. And though the world would go on to change, though electric light would banish the dark and machines would multiply beyond imagination, the essence of this hour would remain untouched. The stillness before dawn, the courage to rise, the fragile hope that every new morning brings. So the light climbed higher, the shadows dissolved, and the world of 1888, humble, aching, radiant in its repetition, breathed once more. And somewhere in the soft rustle of waking, in the sound of footsteps beginning again, you could almost hear the heartbeat of an entire century preparing to move forward. The night was over, the day had returned, and life, in all its quiet wonder, went on.